Today, I'm gonna show you how to do in-camera transitions like Jesse DriftWood, just like this. So it was about a year ago when I discovered Jesse on Peter McKinnon's channel and saw what he was doing on the Stories platform on Instagram and immediately thought, man, I want to do this. So I did. The first story I ever shot was a 15-second clip on my iPhone of me and my wife going for a day date. From there, it blossomed into what is normally about a minute long, and now that IGTV has come out, I'm having a lot of fun with that, shooting 1 to 2 minutes, uninterrupted, not having to worry about 15-second cuts. But one thing I commonly get asked in my DMs, and I know Jesse gets asked this all the time because I see it in the comments, is how do you do the in-camera transitions? Today I'm going to talk about my favorite in-camera transitions, such as up and down, left and right, and rotation whip pans, gliding against an object outside of another object so it kind of looks like you've just magically transformed there. Abstract style transitions that were introduced to me by Peter McKinnon, as well as pushing in and pulling out of certain areas and subjects and making that look really cool. Why use in-camera transitions? I mean, After Effects is a very powerful program. Why would you not just use After Effects and create transitions there? The reason that I use in-camera transitions specifically for my stories and for my vlogs is because it cuts down editing time, it makes me actually think about what I want to shoot rather than just shooting a bunch of stuff and fixing it in post. And it allows me a certain amount of creativity when it comes to shooting B-roll or shooting out in the field or shooting a transitional sequence between one spot or the other that leads the viewer to think twice about what they just saw. In my mind, one of the things that I like most about video creation is if I can make somebody have a prediction error, like they think something is gonna happen and then something else happens and it makes them double take. In-camera transitions is a really easy way of doing that. Not only that, it adds a little bit of spark to something that could otherwise be fairly boring. Now, in some cases, I actually believe I overuse this, and I know Jesse DriftWood himself has said in a recent live stream that he feels like he overuses them too. But it's a stylistic choice, so however much you do or don't use them, it's up to you. It's a lot like putting salt on your food. Some people like a pinch, some people like an unhealthy amount. So let's talk a little bit about the planning process and what goes into it. Realistically, there's one of two ways that you can do it. You can fly by the seat of your pants like I do sometimes, or you can plan it out. If you know the location ahead of time, if you know where you're gonna be shooting, you can put some forethought into this and actually make it really cool. If you don't know where you're shooting ahead of time, or if you have no idea what's gonna go on, you kinda have to fly by the seat of your pants. You look around to see what could I glide against, what could I transition in and out of, and in the event of nothing actually being there, a whip pan always suffices. When it comes to editing these in Premiere Pro or Final Cut, whatever you choose to edit in, when doing these transitions a lot of the time, what I'll do is add a little bit of a speed ramp to give it a little bit more of a flowy effect. Flowy? Is that a thing? Flowy? To give it an effect of being a little bit more smooth, a little bit more whew. And what this allows me to do is possibly cover up any shakes, any issues within the transition itself, basically make it look a little bit more symbiotic, a little bit more like it was meant to be that way. So let's talk about the execution of these transitions. The whip pan is fairly simple. You just want to make sure that you're either shooting at the proper frame rate or going fast enough to create some motion blur. Now, if you're shooting at 23, 24 frames per second, this is pretty easy. Any kind of motion typically results in motion blur. If you're shooting at a higher frame rate or if you're shooting at a higher shutter speed to compensate for an overexposed image because you don't have an ND filter on your camera, this can create a little bit more of a staccato motion and it's a little bit more difficult. Now, in some cases I will add some artificial motion blur, but it's rarely needed. Tips in execution on the whip pan is always make sure that you're gliding against something, whether it's a surface or an object or something to the effect. Where I see a lot of people do this wrong is they might do a whip pan up, but they whip up into an open white sky. Now in some cases this can work just fine. You whip up into a sky and come down out of a light inside the house. That could be cool. But a lot of the times you want that motion blur to cover up the transition itself. If you're talking about an up, down, left, right motion blur, this is actually pretty easy. Where it can be a little bit harder is doing the rotational whip pan. I don't even know if there's a better term for it, that's just what I call it. In that situation, you really want to make sure that you're shooting at 24 frames per second because you get that natural motion blur that can cover the transition. Where I distinguish the difference between a whip pan transition and a gliding transition, where you are actually gliding against an object, is a whip pan, you're normally doing it out in the open, whereas when you're gliding against an object, it helps create the mask of the transition a little bit easier, especially if the objects are close in color. Now what I might do if the gliding transition doesn't work as seamlessly as I want is add the smallest amount of cross dissolve that I possibly can as a transition to mask a little bit of what my audience is seeing and make the transition a little bit more seamless. Ins and outs, or the in and out transition where you go into a dark place, out of a dark place, is something that I really like doing when it comes to shooting in selfie mode and then going into something else, into the world, right? Speed ramping it really helps cover any kind of minor imperfections, but at the same time, make sure that your lens actually fully goes dark when you touch it to something. The other thing with this transition where people go wrong is they'll have their exposure set to automatic, so when you go into the dark place and out into the new place, you have a moment of adjustment with the exposure. You want to make sure that you're shooting on manual exposure mode and making sure that your exposure is locked. That way you get the best of the effect. When it comes to abstract transitions, these are one of the easier ones to execute, but it also requires a little bit of creativity. With abstracts, what you want to do is create some kind of fast motion or movement or camera shake to cover up or lead into a new scene or a transition. A lot of times what I'll end up doing is I'll take small details, or I'll take something that I'm shooting anyways. If I'm shooting a tree, I'll do a close-up of the bark and I'll glide up the tree. Or if I'm shooting somewhere where there's a railing, I'll glide along the railing, or I'll glide along a row of flags at a festival or something like that. And this creates enough that when I speed it up in post, it'll create this abstract video that people almost have to concentrate in order to understand what just happened. And that's kind of the idea of an abstract. The idea of an abstract is it takes a second for your brain to recognize what you're looking at. But this creates a really seamless transition between two clips that can be very visually appealing, especially if you add a little bit of sound design, a little bit of that whoosh between the clips or in the clips to really mask that and give it the best effect.
The rebels, the trouble.
I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you can execute these in your stories, in your vlogs, or you can use these to your advantage in creating a little bit of diversity in your films. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. Leave a comment below if you have any questions. I'll see you next time.